speaking of, well, this is more revolutionary, sort of talking about diverse populations. We talk about that all the time. But to actually have a study like the PROMISE study really dedicate one of its, main goals to figuring out the impact of myeloma and, whether it's MGUS or smoldering on diverse populations is so critical. So Dr. Mikhael, can you talk to us about the PROMISE study?
Yeah, the PROMISE study is really a fantastic study, and I commend Dr. Gobriel and her whole team. I happened to be a part of this program in the early days when we were planning it when I was still at Mayo Clinic, and I just think it's a wonderful and important approach. In Iceland, obviously the numbers are massive, but we recognize that Iceland does not represent the diversity of what we see here in North America, and in particular in people of color. And so in the PROMISE study, they were looking to screen individuals and also use a large database that they have already existing in Boston to look at Black Americans and their true incidence of MGUS and myeloma, but also those individuals independent of race and ethnicity who are first degree relatives of myeloma patients. Because this has always been a challenging question for us to know and really understand. Familial myeloma is really quite rare, but are there ways to detect it more? And sure enough, we found that if we generally think that in patients over 40 or 50 that MGUS is in about 5% of the population, it really is double that in the African American population, and indeed in those who are first degree relatives of myeloma patients in that 10% range, and maybe even higher when we use more some of those sophisticated techniques that I mentioned, like the mass spec. And so the numbers are still coming in. Obviously, they're not iStop numbers, and there's still so much to learn. But I think it was really critical because it really, in this group of individuals, demonstrates to us the greater incidence, how these individuals are greater risk. And speaks to us of the importance of health disparities in multiple myeloma that I know we'll talk more about, because there was great research presented within this field over the course of the meeting. But I'm very thankful that the country, if not the planet, is starting to put a spotlight on health disparities. And the tragedy within the African American community is that not only is disease more common, sadly, we do see that outcomes of survival are significantly reduced in this population. And yet they don't have to be, because in studies that show that African Americans have the same access to therapies as Caucasians, their outcomes can be as good, if not better. So that tells us that there's hope here, that there's that opportunity. And so I think the PROMISE study is a step in that direction to really assess and understand the disease more fully. As doctors, right? Diagnosis always comes before therapy, right? So if we can fully understand the issue, then we may be able to do, and hopefully we'll be able to do more about it. So we're not just talking about these things, we're doing something. So I'm just thankful that we're finally, in a greater community sense, shining a spotlight on the health disparities, is particular in multiple myeloma, and in particular with the African American community, although there are other disparities within the Hispanic community and many other places. But specifically within the African American community, because as we mentioned earlier, the disease is twice as common in this community. And this is a lot of the work that I do at the IMF with the Empower Project, where we're really trying to do a deep dive in the community, raise awareness around this condition, and have people facilitate earlier and more accurate diagnosis, because African American patients typically have a longer time from symptom initiation to diagnosis than Caucasian patients. And so at this year's ASH, I was encouraged to see that there were a whole host of studies that were done that obviously are helping us to diagnose the problem further, that are demonstrating the connection between socioeconomic status and outcomes in myeloma, that there is sadly decreased access, that African American patients, for example, one of the drugs we talked about, daratumumab, that there's a great Canadian study showing that African American patients tend to get it much later in the disease course than Caucasian patients, or that in clinical trials, that when we look at the big pivotal clinical trials, as we call them, that have influenced approval over the last several years, there have been very few, unfortunately, African-American patients on those studies. If we figure that about 20% of all myeloma patients in this country are Black, why is it that our clinical trials have 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6, 7% enrollment within the African-American community? And this was discussed during the meeting in various settings and contexts. And even access to CAR T. So I always talk about the 3 Ts, access to triplets, transplants, and trials we've shown has not been at pace with Caucasians within the African American community. But at this ASH, we heard that similarly, unfortunately, in CAR T, a fourth T, so triplets, transplants, trials, and CAR T are not as accessible. On the other hand, there was also, and I want to be positive, the optimistic realist in me, as I mentioned, is that there were some studies that started to look at greater inclusivity in ranking, in prognostic scoring, and in ways to look at clinical trial sites, for example, in areas where historically we've not had clinical trials. If we do the clinical trials in the same places we've always done them, we may not be as accessible to various members within the community, including the African American community. So, I think, as I say, we need to diagnose the problem fully before we do something. On the other hand, it's time to do something. And I believe that the community is starting to do something, and we're starting to appreciate the importance of doing this, that we've let people be at risk for too long. And it's going to involve all stakeholders, from the policy standpoint in government, within the medical community, within industry, in the way they conduct clinical trials and set expectations of enrollment in clinical trials, and indeed in the lay community as we work together to overcome this inequity and these health disparities.
Thank you for highlighting what is incredibly important, and as you said, is finally, I think, coming to light with the greater community. And so I look forward to more of this. And for Dr. Mikhael's entire conversation, head to thepatientstory.com, where you'll find human answers to your cancer questions.